Hated democracy? Kind of an insufferable know-it-all. Confirmed bisexual king. Eventually put on trial and sentenced to death via the poison hemlock. Socrates is considered the father of philosophy, and his legacy endures 2,500 years after his death. Let's talk about the wild life he lived and the trial that led to his execution. Along the way, we'll learn about how law and democracy worked in Athens, and why the father of philosophy was hated so much by his contemporaries that they killed him. Okay, so hold the damn phone. Let's back this up a bit, okay? The year is 507 BC. And we are chilling in Athens, where the leader, 𝗬𝗓𝗧𝗧, has just introduced democratia, or rule by the people. Then later Pericles came along and really liberalized this idea, focusing on egalitarian ideals, creating jobs to help people without land gain wealth, and he created the people's courts. He built the Acropolis and the Parthenon during Socrates' life. Like, this is the golden age of Greece and Athenian democracy, and this is the first known democracy ever. Okay, here's how it was set up. There were three branches of government. Does that sound familiar? The ecclesia, the boule, and the dicasteria. Okay, the ecclesia was the assembly that governed Athens. Athens was a direct democracy, meaning any member of the voting public was invited to be part of the assembly, which was charged with writing laws and making decisions about foreign policy. They made decisions by simple majority. Whatever gets over 50% wins. So like I said, any member of the voting public could show up to the assembly, which met almost every week. However, hold your horses, because that doesn't mean that anyone who lived in Athens could just show up. No. I said member of the voting public, which was limited to adult men who weren't foreigners or slaves. Okay, so there were about 260,000 people living in Athens at this time, but only about 40,000 of them were members of the voting public. The rest were women, foreigners, and slaves. Okay, so this was a direct democracy, but like even the democracy that all other democracies were based off of was extremely limited. Okay, then you have the boule or council, which was a group of 500 members of the voting public, 50 representatives from each of the 10 Athenian tribes, and they served for 1 year and were picked via a lottery, not by election. And they met every day to conduct the day-to-day runnings of the government. 500 dudes! So the theory was that they were chosen at random to avoid outside influence from money or popularity and prevented the establishment of a permanent class of governing people. Though historians say that wealthy people and their relatives somehow got picked very randomly, more often than anyone else, to serve on the council. Very interesting. Then we have the dicasteria or courts. They also ran every day, and 500 jurors were chosen at random from a pool of male citizens over 30. 500 jurors! And they made a simple majority vote to find people guilty or innocent and could sentence people to death or come up with whatever penalties they wanted. An absolute madhouse, okay? There weren't lawyers, there weren't prosecutors who brought cases or defense attorneys protecting the accused. There were no police. Anyone from the voting class could prosecute a case. Like, any schmuck off the street could bring forth a criminal case before the 500 jurors, and 51% of those 500 guys could be like, yeah, kill him. And that was the law. This was the democracy that Socrates was born into in Athens around the year 470 BC. His dad was a stoneworker, his mom was a midwife, and he was a citizen of Athens, so he could participate in democracy, which he did. Though he never wrote anything down, so what we know about him is based mainly on the writings of his student Plato and other of his contemporaries, though historians question how authentic these writings actually are. But all historians do agree on one thing. Socrates was ugly as heck. They describe him as having a round, squashed-in face with a snub little nose, big bulgy eyes, and a big old belly. Poor guy. He didn't really seem to care that much though. He was always walking around barefoot, rarely showered, and only owned one tattered coat. Apparently people either loved him or loathed him, which is how he found such devoted followers. Now, we're not going to get really deep into Socratic philosophy, but the basics are this. Socrates claimed that he was enlightened because he knew nothing, and he knew that he knew nothing, and the constant pursuit of wisdom was the only way to live. The unexamined life is not worth living. Yeah, that was old Socrates.
Socrates.
But even though he said he knew nothing, he was also a bit of a know-it-all. He told people that the only way to live was to constantly question everything, but anyone who questioned him was wrong. He was the ultimate devil's advocate. The idea is that if you keep questioning everything, you create new ways of thinking about things. And this lives on today in the hallowed halls of every godforsaken law school in this country. Socratic method is the preferred teaching method across the board, which literally just means that the professors cold call you about the day's reading with random questions, the answers to which you have to know on the spot. Thanks a lot, Socrates. Okay, so the other thing to know about Socrates was that even though he participated in Athenian democracy, he was a huge critic critic of democracy. His main thing was that any democracy was only as good as the voting public. So having a voting public that is uneducated and didn't think critically and philosophically about democracy, what it means, what's really important to leading a society, this would lead to people electing demagogues and politicians who made shiny promises because they couldn't think critically and look for deeper wisdom in their leaders. Basically, a voting public is only as good as its educational system, and letting just any random schmuck off the street vote could lead to disastrous consequences. According to Plato, Socrates was actually pretty into totalitarianism. He argued that a ruling class that was trained for years on how to be leaders and rulers was probably better. The general public to Socrates was pretty fucking stupid, which tracks with his general personality we've learned about thus far. But also his ideas kind of track with the way the United States democracy is going right now, so what do I know? Anyway, Socrates made a lot of enemies with his ideas about democracy, and also because he was pretty condescending. This guy was literally getting beat up in the streets because he was questioning everything about the society that had been so recently built, but also because he thought most people were stupid and was apparently a bit of an asshole. He also pissed a lot of people off with his thoughts about religion. Greek mythology involved gods who were fallible and good and evil and exhibited the best and worst traits that exist in humans. And Athenian life was built on a strong foundation of religious rituals and processes. Socrates, on the other hand, believed that the gods were good, benevolent, omnipotent types who had a lot of control and holiness. Basically, his version of the gods tracked a lot more with Christianity's idea of God, though Christianity, of course, did not exist yet. But a lot of people were not pleased with his ideas. A lot of people also didn't like him fraternizing with the youth of the city. Like I said, you either loved him or hated him, and he had a lot of young guys he hung around with who loved what he was teaching. He's also said to have had regular sexual relationships with them, though being a gay in Greece was a-okay, especially if you were a man, and it was common for older men to get with younger boys, which is a question for another day. So it seems that for many years, Socrates was seen as the kind of town eccentric, just wandering around, talking about his ideas, finding some following, but mostly harmless. Problems arose, however, when his anti-democratic teachings had actual consequences in the form of his anti-democratic followers trying and succeeding to overthrow the Athenian democracy. The worst was this guy by the name of Critias. He was one of a group known as the 30 Tyrants, and he led a very bloody revolt in the year 404 BC that overthrew the democracy and led to a year of tyranny and bloodshed. 1,500 of the top Democrats in Athens were put to death, estates were confiscated, 5,000 people were banished from the city, and Socrates did nothing to try to stop any of this, despite the fact that supposedly he had some sway, considering these people were, at least in part, following his teachings. At one point, the oligarchy asked him to arrest a man who was a known Democrat, and Socrates refused, apparently in moral protest. But then he, didn't do anything. Didn't warn the guy, didn't try to talk some sense into the oligarchs, nothing. Just went home and chilled. After a year of this rule by bloodshed, a democratic revolution overthrew the 30 tyrants and restored democracy in Athens. So because of this, Socrates was no longer just considered the town kook. There was something a lot more sinister and dangerous in his teachings. And this idea was solidified in the year 401 BC, so just 2 years after democracy was restored, when another young anti-democratic follower of Socrates tried to overthrow the government, this time unsuccessfully. Okay, and of course, this is pretty ancient history, so we don't know exactly what was going on in the minds of Athenians at the time. But it's thought that this was kind of the final straw for Athenians and all these anti-democratic youth that Socrates was inspiring. I'll remind you, Socrates was born around the year 470 BC, so by the year 401, he was 69 years old. Nice, but absolutely ancient. He'd been doing his teachings his entire adult life, but by the year 401, people had had just about enough of this kooky guy, and in 399 BC, he was put on trial for impiety and corrupting the youth. Now, the Athenian legal system doesn't have much resemblance to our legal system in the US, as it was pretty much entirely citizen-driven, meaning a citizen had to come forward, arrest a person, bring that person before the judge, try that person, provide their own witnesses and evidence. There were no prosecutors or lawyers, no police. They had to be their own personal investigators. When a crime was happening, no one yelled out, "Call the police!" Instead, they would yell out for witnesses. So people just in the street passing by would come over and assist and be present to act as witnesses if the issue went to trial. If a crime was committed, like something was stolen and the owner didn't know who did it, they would act as their own private investigator, talking to witnesses, even searching people's houses. The only rules for conducting house searches as a citizen were that the owner of the house must consent consent, and the searching person had to leave his cloak out front, because apparently it's harder to plant evidence when you don't bring your cloak inside. Fun fact. So in 399, Socrates was charged, and he was issued his summons in the presence of witnesses by a guy named 𝗦𝗫𝗡𝗧, a poet. All history really knows about 𝗦𝗫𝗡𝗧 is what Plato wrote about him. Because again, Plato is basically Socrates' biographer. He wrote down all of Socrates' teachings, and most of what we know about Socrates' trial comes from the writings of Plato as well. Plato described 𝗦𝗫𝗡𝗧 as having a beak, long straight hair, and a beard which was ill-grown. There's debate over why 𝗦𝗫𝗡𝗧 brought these charges. It could have been because he was strongly religious and took issue with Socrates' religious beliefs. It could have been because of Socrates' anti-democratic teachings that led to the brief overthrow of Athenian democracy. Or it could have been because of that one time when Socrates said that poets were just glorified flatterers and the only people they moved with their words were women, children, and slaves. Woof. It could also be that 𝗦𝗫𝗡𝗧 was merely a young puppet working at the behest of Socrates' two other accusers, 𝗦𝗍𝗔 and Lycon. The real mastermind behind the trial of Socrates was 𝗦𝗍𝗔, a prominent politician in Athens who helped lead the democratic uprising that restored Athenian democracy after the fall of the 30 tyrants. Remember those guys? The one who at least in part were guided by Socrates' teachings? Yeah. And after democracy was restored, Socrates continued to speak poorly of politicians, including 𝗦𝗍𝗔. He thought Athenian statesmen had nothing to offer in terms of an understanding of virtue. It's very likely that to 𝗦𝗍𝗔, Socrates' powerful condemnations of the institutions central to Athenian society was dangerous, and something that 𝗦𝗍𝗔 had spent his life fighting against. Oh, and also 𝗦𝗍𝗔 probably hated Socrates because Socrates slept with his son and tried to convince his son not to follow in his father's footsteps. Socrates is quoted as saying, "I had a brief relationship with his son and I did not find him lacking in spirit." Socrates was sloppy, y'all. We don't know much about Lycon, Socrates' third accuser. He was an orator, which Socrates held in the same regard as poets. Socrates thought that orators didn't want to actually benefit anyone or seek the truth, but instead just wanted to use their voice to gain power and influence. If I had a nickel for every time someone said that about YouTubers. Oh, and also one of Socrates' friends slept with Lycon's son, a relationship that Socrates publicly praised. Again, sloppy. So with all of this background, 𝗦𝗫𝗡𝗧, the poet, shows up at Socrates' place with some witnesses and is like, "You're being tried for impiety and corrupting Athenian youth, and we're taking you to the magistrate judge." So they took him to the royal stoa where the magistrate judge was hanging out, and they were like, "Here's Socrates. Here's what we want to try him for. Is that cool?" And the magistrate judge was like, "Yeah, go for it." And he set a date for the preliminary hearing. At the preliminary hearing, the formal charges were read. This indictment and affidavit is sworn by 𝗦𝗫𝗡𝗧, the son of 𝗦𝗫𝗡𝗧 of Pythos, against Socrates, the son of Sophroniscus of Alopechae. Socrates is guilty of refusing to recognize the gods recognized by the state, and of introducing new divinities. He is also guilty of corrupting the youth. The penalty demanded is death. Then both sides gave their testimony and questioned each other. After hearing both sides, the magistrate determined that the case had merit and could be brought to trial. So he drew up formal charges and posted notice to the whole city that Socrates was going to be tried. When the day of the trial arrived, the 500-man jury gathered in the agora in the Athens city center. They sat on wooden benches, and a large throng of spectators, including then 27-year-old Plato, stood to the side, separated by a guardrail of some sort. Socrates' three accusers were given a total of 3 hours to present their case. The time was measured by a water clock, where one vessel with a tiny hole at the base was placed on a pedestal and filled with water, and that water would trickle out of the hole and into a vessel below it that had rings to show the passage of time as the water slowly filled the vessel. There is no existing record of what the three accusers said that day, but they likely brought forward witness testimony and evidence of Socrates' long history of questioning Athenian institutions to show that he had been impious and that his ideas were corrupting Athenian youth. His connection to the uprising that led to the rule of the 30 tyrants, a horrible time in Athenian history that had just concluded a couple years before the trial, was probably pretty damning in itself. Then Socrates had 3 hours to defend himself. At one point there were dozens of accounts of his defense, but they have all been destroyed, and we're only left with the accounts of his own followers, which are far from verbatim. Okay? According to them, Socrates was entirely unapologetic in his defense, instead contending, "I'm not a teacher, I'm just a guy wandering around town answering people's questions questions. But honestly, you're welcome, because I'm helping the Athenian youth become more educated and philosophical. And by doing that, I'm actually saving their souls. So I'm not going to apologize or stop. Usually during these trials, the defendant would plead with the jury for mercy and bring up their wife and children and try to pull on the heartstrings of the jurors. Socrates didn't do any of that, even though he did have a wife and 3 sons at this point. He wasn't interested in apologizing because, as we've learned, this guy had an ego on him and he knew he was in the right. He was also 71 years old at this point and certainly had 1 foot in the damn grave, so like, why not take it 1 step further and become a martyr, you know? So once each side rested, it was up to the 500 jurors to vote on whether they thought Socrates was innocent or guilty. They weren't given instructions by a judge as to how to interpret the law. Each juror just had to take what was presented to him and decide for himself. Whichever got the most votes won. They voted using these ballot discs that they placed in 2 marked urns. The voting began, each juror deliberated individually and then approached the urns to put their ballot in the one that they believed was the correct choice. At the end, the ballots were counted. Of the 500 jurors, 220 voted to acquit Socrates. 280 voted that he was guilty. This wasn't the end for Socrates, though. After a defendant was found guilty, they moved on to the penalty phase of the trial, where each side would put forward the proposed penalty and the jury would vote on which was appropriate. The accusers proposed the death penalty for Socrates. A typical defendant in this situation would have countered with proposing exile instead of death, something the accusers and the jury probably would have been satisfied with. Not old Socrates, though, no ma'am. Instead, Socrates very audaciously suggested that he should actually probably be rewarded for his service to society. So instead of a punishment, he proposed that he should actually receive free meals every day. Obviously, he knew the jury would reject that, so historians speculate that at this point, Socrates was ready to die, and he was just trying to get one last rise out of Athenian society. They didn't accept that proposal, however, and they forced him to come up with some kind of actual punishment to propose, so he eventually suggested a small fine of 1 mina of silver, which wasn't much, but it did constitute about 1/5 of his net worth. His followers, including Plato, came forward and said they'd come up with enough silver that he could actually pay a 30 mina fine. This was still pretty measly compared to the crimes that he had been found guilty of, however. And when the jury voted, only 140 of them supported the punishment by fine. 360 jurors voted that Socrates should be put to death. According to Plato, as Socrates was being led off to jail, he says, "The hour of departure has arrived, and we go our ways. I to die and you to live, which to the better fate is known only to God." This was likely made up by Plato, as no record shows that defendants were actually allowed to speak after being sentenced. By law in Athens, the death penalty was carried out via the drinking of hemlock, a poisonous plant. Any part of the plant, when ingested even in small amounts, is fatal to humans. The poison was created by making a tea out of the dried plant. Socrates spent his final days in an Athenian jail cell, the ruins of which still exist today. Plato and his other followers attempted to bribe a guard to let Socrates flee the city instead of die, which Socrates declined. Instead, Plato describes his final moments. He stoically drank the potion, quite readily and cheerfully. Up till this moment, most of us were able with some decency to hold back our tears, but when we saw him drinking the poison to the last drop, we could restrain ourselves no longer. As the chill sensation got to his waist, Socrates uncovered his head, he had put something over it, and said his last words. "Crito, we owe a cock to Asclepius. Do pay it, don't forget." "Of course," said Crito. "Do you want to say anything else?" There was no reply to this question, but after a while he gave a slight stir, and the attendant uncovered him and examined his eyes. Then Crito saw that he was dead. He closed his mouth and eyelids. This was the end of our friend, the best, wisest, and most upright man of any that I have ever known. In his final words, Socrates asked for a rooster to be sacrificed to Asclepius, the god of the healthy. This sacrifice was typical to give thanks for recovery from illness. So Socrates' final words are thought to mean that he viewed his death as a release from the disease of life. The death of Socrates made him a martyr, and his pupils, like Plato and Aristotle, went on to form entire schools of thought based around Socratic teachings. Plato's Academy, Aristotle's Lyceum, the Cynics, the Stoics. His teachings lived on into medieval times, and Plato's writings on Socrates were translated by early Muslim scholars. In modern times, great political thinkers like Voltaire wrote extensively on the teachings of Socrates, and he continues to be a towering figure in philosophical study to this day. If you enjoyed this video, consider supporting my work over on Patreon. We have private live streams, and you can play a role in deciding what content appears on this channel next. If you enjoyed this video, you might enjoy this whole video of mine where I react to Hamilton the musical and we learn about dual law. Thanks so much for watching. Have a great day. Bye-bye!